You've read the headlines that our prisons and jails are this nation's largest psychiatric care provider. We'll take a look at what's true and what we're doing right here in the Northland to address these issues next on our 100th episode of Speak Your Mind. Welcome to Speak Your Mind. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps, licensed psychologist with the Human Development Center. It's always kind of tricky talking about mental illness in the criminal justice system because we don't want to add to the stigma that already exists around mental illness. After all, one of the main goals of Speak Your Mind is to reduce the stigma that surrounds mental illness. And how do we do that? Well, for the last 99 episodes, and for this one too, the way we do that is to talk openly, honestly, and compassionately about the facts. And the fact is that some people with mental illness end up in our criminal justice system. And a second fact is that these are some of our most disenfranchised members of our communities. So tonight, we're going to talk about what happens to mentally ill people who end up in the criminal justice system and how that system is serving us. My guests are here tonight to tell you what is true and what's not true about mental illness and the criminal justice system. You can be a part of tonight's conversation by calling the numbers on your screen right now locally. Dial 218-788-2844 or call toll-free at 1-877-307-8762. We'll be answering your questions throughout tonight's show. Joining me is the Honorable Sally Tarnowski, a judge of the 6th Judicial District chambered here in Duluth. She's a founding member of and presides over Southern St. Louis County's Mental Health Court. And Dr. Jacqueline Buffington-Vollum is a licensed psychologist and an associate professor of criminology in the Department of Sociology Anthropology at UMD. That was a lot of ologies there we had going. So now I have to tell you, I'm very excited to have you as my guest here tonight, but I'm also very excited. I'm always excited when we're timely, and tonight we are able to be timely because Senator Franken, who was one of the primary authors of the Justice and Mental Health Collaboration Act, just got that passed through the Senate today, right hot off the presses. So now it has to pass in the House in order for it to be a bill. And the purpose of this is for there to be greater collaboration between the criminal justice system and the mental health system by virtue of giving both of those systems funding to support people with mental illness who are involved in the criminal justice system. See how timely this is for tonight? So that's pretty exciting. And I'm also really excited to have, one of the reasons I'm really excited, I'm always excited when we have authors on the book. Now, I have to say to my viewing audience here that a book this thick, maybe I wasn't quite as excited when I asked Jackie on, because this is a bit of a read. It's not just, it's not a beach read, but it's an excellent book. She is one of the co-authors of the book, The Criminalization of Mental Illness. Thanks so much for being here. And I think, for those of us in the viewing audience who are not really familiar with this topic, just even start by telling us, what does this mean, the criminalization of mental illness?
The criminalization of mental illness refers to the increasing trend since the 1950s. As we started to shut down our state psychiatric facilities, we found more and more people with serious mental illness in our jails and prisons. And so that's what the title criminalization of mental illness is referring to, the overrepresentation of people with serious mental illness in the jails and prisons.
And so how do we account for how that all happened? So first of all, there was an emptying of the hospitals and the shutting down of the state hospitals. And the idea behind that was so that people would live more independently and presumably have better lives in the process of doing that. And it would seem like if they are now going from a state mental hospital to a state correctional facility, that doesn't speak of better to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, in the 1950s, in the 1960s, there was the movement to deinstitutionalize, is what they called it, the deinstitutionalization of state hospitals. And the idea was that they would construct a series of community mental health centers, and that we would move our psychiatric inpatients from these state hospitals that were at the far ends of the state, closer to home, where they would have the social support of their family and friends. The problem is, and it was President Kennedy who signed into law the Community Mental Health Centers Act. The problem came in that he signed the act into law, and then he was assassinated in the Vietnam War, and various things prevented the money from coming through. It was appropriated, but it didn't come through, and so the community mental health centers that were built had to prioritize, and they didn't want to work with the seriously mentally ill. And so more and more people with serious mental illness were becoming homeless because there weren't those mental health services in the community.
And I guess I might add to it, as a person who works in a community mental health center, I would say I'm not even sure how much would want to, as if a community mental health center is also already burdened, as it is, to simply add more population without adding resources to help the people. You've created a system that is bound to fail.
Absolutely.
Then. So tell us, Judge, before kind of the notion of therapeutic jurisprudence, we'll talk a little bit about that later, but the traditional court system, tell us about how the traditional court system works for people who are mentally ill and what happens with people.
Well, depending on how mentally ill they are, if they've committed a crime, they'll come before the court, and if somebody thinks that they have committed the crime as a result of the mental illness and they so did not understand that they were committing a crime, we can do something called a Rule 20, which if the Rule 20 finds that indeed they did not understand the nature of the fact that it was a crime that they committed, or that they can't help in their defense, they may be civilly committed for a time until they're rehabilitated.
So that's a Rule 20 is a competency to stand trial, and being competent to help in your own defense.
Right, yes. And so, but once they're restored to competency, they would be treated just like any other individual, but they traditionally, they would not necessarily get the rehabilitation that they might need. So restorative justice and other types of courts have been established in order to try to help alleviate that, keep them from re-entering the criminal justice system because they have gone untreated for so long.
Tell us, Jackie, who are the people with mental illness who are ending up in the criminal justice system? What are their characteristics? Because we want to make it very clear that having a mental illness doesn't mean you're going to end up in the criminal justice system.
Absolutely.
So that's the part that I kind of referred to at the very beginning, where I said, this is always kind of tricky about, because we don't want people to believe that. And I was talking with my producer before the show, and he was saying, the more of these mass shootings there are, the more they talk about a person with a mental illness committed the mass shooting, the more people begin to believe things about mental illness that aren't all true. Mm-hmm. So not all people with mental illness are going to be dangerous. What are some of the characteristics that distinguish people who end up in the criminal justice system and who have a mental illness?
I'm glad you brought up that point, because that is actually something that I teach about all the time, and I talk with everyone that I know about, is the media's depiction of people with serious mental illness as being violent. And I mean, I hear that all the time, that anytime someone commits a crime or an act that we don't understand, they must have been mentally ill. And that's not true. People with serious mental illness, only depending upon the study you read, about 1 to 10% will ever commit an act of violence. And in fact, people with mental illness are more likely to be victims of crime than to be perpetrators of crime. Absolutely. And another statistic that tends to surprise people is that of all homicides, only 4% are committed by people with serious mental illness. So violence is much rarer than what most people think when it comes to people with serious mental illness. Usually, most of the time, people with serious mental illness, when they do end up in the criminal justice system, a lot of the time it's for minor misdemeanors, drunk in public, public nuisance, disorderly conduct. And certainly there are, I'm not trying to suggest that people with mental illness never commit, more serious crimes. But by and large, the majority of the offenses that they commit are lesser offenses. And most of the violence isn't committed by people with mental illness.
And so one of the things I think that we know also is that some of the people who with mental illness who end up in the criminal justice system have tragic backgrounds, long trauma histories, often have a co-occurring substance abuse disorder. Unstable housing is often a part of the picture, and poor family and community supports. And has that been what your experience
Absolutely.
has been?
And I think a big piece is a lot of times they haven't maintained their insurances. So even if they had medications at one point, they've gone in to get their medication and the insurance has been lost, and so they can't afford it. And then they do have the co-occurring because they've started to self-medicate with alcohol or street drugs. So.
And that's what the research shows as well, in terms of who's ending up there. Let's talk about this concept of therapeutic jurisprudence, which that's a handy little phrase that just rolls off the tongue. Explain that for the viewing audience.
You want me to talk about mental health court? Or just the idea
well, I
of
think the concept first of there's the traditional court, and I think that most of the viewing audience does not connect the word therapeutic
with court?
Yeah.
Right. So instead of sending someone to jail where they're not going to get the help that they need, the medication that they need, the therapy they may need, or any of their treatment needs met, we try to engage them in services in the community and keep them on probation and back out in the community. There are many ways of handling that through probation. Sometimes I'll have people come back to court and see me every 3-4 months just to make sure they're maintaining their therapeutic connections. The probation officers oversee that. But the idea is to connect them with services that they need in the community for support and keep them therapeutically involved rather than coming back out of the jail in probably a worse shape than they went in.
So let's talk a little bit then about just sort of the structure of mental health court, because there's an entire team. I need to disclose that I'm actually a member of that team. So this is kind of one of those things like I'm asking her a question I know the answer to, but you guys don't know the answer to this, so that's why I'm asking the question. So talk a little bit about the structure of the team and how that works, because that's very different than a traditional court system.
Very collaborative. Our team consists of myself, a prosecutor, a public defender, psychology. We have chemical dependency treatment. We have probation officer. We have a Duluth police officer on the team, and we have a case manager, as well as someone we call a client advocate, who really kind of fills the gap between what other services can provide. We all meet, mental health court is once a week. We all meet right before court for about an hour and a half to talk about each and every one of the participants, see what's going on with them, how engaged they are with treatment, what victories they've achieved that week, what supports they may need, any issues that may be arising.
And so the purpose of this really is to provide those wraparound services to address any of anything that might be missing in this person's life that would give them an opportunity to be successful, then whether it be treatment or housing, or chemical dependency, medication. And so what do we know about the effectiveness of these courts?
There's quite a bit of research on mental health courts. Mental health courts derived out of drug courts. Drug courts were the earliest problem-solving courts. And in the 1990s, early 2000s, we started to see mental health courts popping up around the country. And what we know is that mental health courts, there may be, because the docket isn't they can't take as many clients. Mental health courts have a smaller capacity. It takes more time from the judge each week or when they come in to court. And so on the front end, it seems like it's more expensive, but we know it actually is very effective. Mental health courts are very effective in cutting back on the number of jail days, which are days in jail beds, very expensive, number of hospital days. So consistently, we know that mental health courts are effective in reducing those, as well as improving the quality of life for the defendants.
So what you're saying is that if you can't get behind this concept from a human being compassionate point of view because it improves lives, you ought to be able to get behind the concept because it saves communities money. I think that there would be some people out there that would view something like a mental health court as, what do you mean these people commit crimes and now they're kind of getting off free for this because they don't have to go to prison, or they don't have to go to jail, and so why should they get a free ride when I wouldn't get a free ride if I went before you?
Well, I'm not sure that it's a free ride, and B, I'm not sure that other people who are not mentally ill don't get something, you want to call it a free ride. They're still going to be placed on probation. They just aren't going to get the types of services. But I think the critical piece is that what we are trying to achieve is to prevent this person from committing more crimes. In the end, I want to know as a community member that a person who has committed a crime is not going to commit more crimes. Once they've done their time, they will come out if they haven't received the services that they need in the interim because they went to prison and did not get the treatment that they needed. There's no assurance that and of course there's no assurance anytime, but they haven't received the treatment that they needed ultimately. Whereas the mental health court does help them to achieve that. They don't graduate from the court if they don't do the things that they're supposed to do, and ultimately if they don't succeed in the court, they will do their prison time. That is the stick at the end, I guess.
And I don't think it's even, I characterized it as a free ride, but I know how hard our participants
it is not a free ride. Interesting.
Have to work, right? I mean, I think that might be some communities' members' perceptions, but it's like, oh my gosh, these people have so much work that they need to do, and they're really under huge scrutiny from the court.
Much more scrutiny than the ordinary probation person. To a person that has graduated, they have said how easy they thought this was going to be when they entered it. And 2 years later, or sometimes even 3 years later, they look back and say, that was not at all what I anticipated this was going to be, but what a success it's been.
Does it matter, Jackie, if courts are set up in terms of who they accept, whether it's misdemeanors or felons? Because I know that mental health courts vary both across the state in terms of who they accept as participants, but also across the nation as well. That there's not like a recipe for how to run a mental health court per se.
Right. Yeah, the first generation of mental health courts primarily focused on misdemeanors. The second and the third generation of mental health courts have started to accept, and in the case of Duluth Mental Health Court, the participants have to have a felony.
Right.
And so certainly working with defendants with felonies can be much more challenging. But the research continues to show that even with the newer generations of courts that do accept more severe cases, more serious crimes, they still are cutting down on, they are still effective in cutting down on jail days and hospital days and quality of life.
And I think that from my perspective, if we weren't going to accept people with felonies, that's where I feel like we can do the greatest good, both in terms of the life of the individual person, but in terms of the life of our community as well. I think as a community, we want to be a safer, healthier community, right? And so why would we let the person who is most in need go without? That would be my philosophy. What would you have to say?
I agree. That was really behind when we initiated the court. What we wanted to achieve was, we could see people had committed crime after crime, and they slowly were committing more serious and more serious crimes. And so to help people with the most need, we decided that the felons were the ones that we wanted to work with.
There's been some criticism, I understand, Jackie, and part of that was because I did my homework. I read part of her book there. Is one of the criticisms is that having mental health court is further stigmatizing to the participants by segregating them and putting them in a thing that we call mental health court. And so that somehow is seen by some critics as further stigmatizing. And what's your response to that?
That is one of the arguments. And another one of the arguments is that people in mental health courts and other problem-solving courts are under greater scrutiny and are more likely to be detected for any probation violations, and they really are challenging for defendants to go through. In my opinion, the impact that it has on quality of lives is worth it. But that is definitely something that needs to be considered and needs to be weighed out. Weighed is the potential stigma that can be involved.
I do think most of if not all of our participants want to be there also. They want to be well, and they know this is a way they can achieve that.
And I guess I would say, though, too, that I don't know how it is that calling a mental illness is stigmatizing. And I feel we need to get over that. We're not saying a person is a mental illness. We're saying a person has a mental illness that grossly affects their life, and they know that it affects their life. And to be able to give people the help they need by having a system that more is able to take into account the individual and who the individual is. That's kind of what we're built on in this country, is that whole concept of individuality, and to not just be a number in the system. I don't personally see how that necessarily kind of can be stigmatizing in that way. Tell us of what your own experience has been like, Judge, of watching people go through the court, watching participants go through the court.
You know, it truly is a remarkable experience. It's the highlight of my week. We watch a participant who goes from really, maybe even the first 2 to 3 months, really doesn't want to be there, is resisting treatment, is resisting doing what we ask them to do, continuing to use. But ultimately, each and every one of them kind of turn this corner where we can see that they suddenly start to get it. And their quality of life changes significantly. They just start to blossom and become the people that they are. And we get to see that change happen in them. And in fact, we have a fellow graduating tomorrow. And I think of the 2 years he's been in the court, and it's just been this remarkable change that he has come into his own.
I have to say, I'm doing the program evaluation of the court, and I have to say that it's the highlight of my week as well. I can do the research that I do and have the statistics and the numbers, but it's really seeing it in action and seeing the impact that it has on the participants that it's really amazing.
And they support each other, you know, they clap for each other, they're very, it's just a wonderful experience for me. So, and I do think that their success is and their hard work to get there is amazing to me.
Is this the wave of the future, do you think, Jackie?
I think we will continue to see more and more problem-solving courts. Mental health courts are popping up all over the country. We're starting to see we had talked about the mental health court here in town only accepts felons. We now have the community court that is, it's not necessarily all the participants have serious mental illness, but a lot of them do. And the community court is misdemeanants with chronic homelessness and substance abuse, and many have mental health issues. Yeah, I think that we will just continue to see problem-solving courts popping up all over the country.
And we see that as a good thing.
We do.
Right? Changing lives. We are out of time here. Thanks so much for joining us. And so what do I want to say by closing? It's one of the best part of my weeks too, other than of course being here with all of you. And here's what's remarkable of that. What's remarkable is that a lot of people who who are participants in our mental health court may not have the best family situations. And what happens in that court is that court becomes their family. And that kind of support, what do we know about that kind of support? You know what that means for you and your own families. And that's what some of these people have in their life, sometimes for the very first time. It's transformative. Societies will be judged based on how we treat our poorest members, our most disenfranchised members. And so we can be pretty proud here in Duluth that we have a mental health court headed up by our very own Judge Tarnowski that rises all of us to the level that we want to be. So thanks so much for joining the discussion this week. And don't forget to visit us on the web at speakyourmindonline.org, where you can find a schedule of our topics and resource links. And join us next week when we'll talk about gender fluidity in children on our next show, Defining Gender, Kids and Teens Living Outside the Box. I'm Dr. Carolyn Phelps. Thanks for watching and good night.